I'll put it this way. I was a problem in school. I mean, I remember I have a 9-year-old son who's also having some problems in school right now. Very much the kinds of problems that I have. He was restless. He is easily distracted. The things that the teacher wanted him to learn are not necessarily the things that are most important to him to be learning. And my wife and I talk about, we're worried about our son. We want our son to do well in school. And I say, yeah, but I was just the same way when I was in school. The things that school wanted me to do were not necessarily the things that were most important to me. And so for me, it took the form of not behaving very well. It's funny to think now that I'm a professor and very successful and I teach teachers, but if my students had seen me when I was 9 years old, they would have thought, this kid will never become anything important. But now I see, from my perspective now, I see that not only is my failing, I keep hitting the microphone, I'm sorry, not only my failing and my behavior, but also the failing of the school, or at least some of the teachers in my school, to identify what I did care about, what was important to me, and to try to find a way to connect what they wanted to teach to the things that I was interested in and motivated to do. And that's a different starting point in education than saying, here's what you need to learn, your job is to learn what we think is important. I think certainly if I was a young person today, I would be completely immersed in the technology. I would be playing games all the time. I don't, and as an adult. My son is making movies now with a video camera. And I think those are the kinds of things that I see in my son, the things that I think I would be doing. I would be wanting to use technology to create things and make things that were important to me. And in the process, he's learning a lot. But it's not necessarily school information that he's learning. What I would say is that the most important thing is to understand that the nature of technology is changing now, and that we use expressions like ICT, information and communication technology, that aren't really very good descriptions of a lot of what people are doing with technology now. Is YouTube an information and communication technology? Well, it's something else. It's making videos. I could give a lot of examples where the nature of the internet is much more a creative space, a place for building and making and sharing the products of creativity and knowledge. And I know that there's resistance from teachers. I know that that's part of the burden that we face as teacher educators. But one of the ways in which I try to get teachers more involved in this is by getting them involved in the pleasures of creating and making things themselves. All the teachers in all my programs, I tell them that the things that they build from my courses go on the web and that other people will be able to see them too. A typical school assignment or a paper is only ever seen by two people: the student who writes it, the professor who grades it and then turns it back, or an examination is only ever seen by two people. A product that goes on the web is seen by hundreds or thousands of people. And so the most important thing, I think, for teachers is to be involved in that culture of the internet as a creative place, as a place for collaboration, sharing, and producing new knowledge and new resources. I think if we can get them to understand that, some of the resistance goes away, because they aren't just thinking about this as a tool that's being imposed on them, but rather something that they're participating in and personally benefiting from. Well, of course, this is just a first impression to a very serious situation. But I would have some questions about this. One is, did anything that happened in the classroom happen because of the technology? Or is it some things that happened in classrooms all the time, but we don't necessarily see because they're not videotaped or they're not posted on YouTube? You could even say that it's a good thing that we find out that these things are happening. It's not a good thing that it happens, of course, but it's a good thing that we find out that it happens because it alerts us to a problem. And where does violence come from? Where does the hostility to teachers come from? I'll give you a separate case which is kind of similar that happened in Korea. I gave a talk and somebody mentioned an example in Korea where a teacher was physically abusing one of the students in the class, and another student took a picture, took a video of the teacher abusing the student. The teacher, of course, was disciplined for that. But it was very upsetting to the teachers in this country because they suddenly felt like students were surveilling them and sort of spying on them. And many teachers thought, uh-oh, what happens if my students start doing this to me? This is not a simple situation or a simple problem at all, but I think this is the time that we live in. I think most people thought that was a good thing because what was secret or private became public in a way that helped people to become aware of it. These tools of creating information and creating news and sharing it are in the hands of young people. They're in the hands of more and more people now. And there's good and bad manifestations of that. The situation with the teacher with their hair on fire is obviously a negative example in terms of what happened. But maybe it alerts us to problems, that makes us more aware of problems, that maybe will help us to recognize them and deal with them, that before then had been sort of below the surface. I think one issue that applies in both contexts is what we call the digital divide, which I know you deal with here. It's a global problem. It's not just a U.S. problem. The digital divide is the inequality of access between people who live in certain parts of the country or go to certain schools and can afford a very high level of access to technology, both in schools and in their homes and in other places, and other people who have very limited access to technology, or in some cases none at all. And clearly that's something that Argentina and I think almost all countries around the world are dealing with. The people who have access to technology have even more opportunities to learn, to get jobs, to network and to make connections that benefit them more and more and more, that people who don't have access to those same technology networks never even get to participate. Another one, which is partly related to the example, is the uses that young people make of the technologies for non-educational or even anti-educational purposes, whether it's surfing the web for pornography or using their cell phones in this way to record embarrassing or insulting information. And so one of the ways in which people often deal with them in schools is through acts of prohibition. I understand where that prohibitionist response comes from, because these are, as we talked about, real dangers and real distractions. They can even become erosive to the climate of the school or of the classroom, erosive to the authority of the teacher. On the other hand, the technologies are increasingly part of our lives. They're part of young people's lives. And I don't think we can solve this problem simply through a prohibitionist approach. I don't think we can solve them just by saying we're going to keep these things out of schools and pretend that they don't exist, because they're too valuable as potential educational resources to be left outside the school or left outside the classroom. And I think the challenge for educators is more one of how do we use these things for educationally productive purposes than how do we keep them out of the school entirely. One of the myths of technology is the myth of technological progress, that new technologies solve our problems and make our lives better. Sometimes that's true. But I think every technology, even technologies that make our lives better, also create new problems, new difficulties that we usually don't anticipate when we first invent the technology or first adopt the technology. And typically, we only really find out about the dangers or the risks of the technology after the fact, after we've already become partly dependent on it, and after the fact that it's probably too late to make the technology go away. And so this idea of risks and promises, potentials and dangers, possibilities and limitations, to me are the two sides of every technology. I give my students an assignment in school, and that is go out into your neighborhoods and interview some of the elderly people about their childhood and what it was like 60 years ago or 70 years ago in this country or in this neighborhood, and do oral histories with those elderly people. And then we'll bring those videos back into the classroom, we'll download them on the computer, and we'll do an oral history project for our social studies class about the history of our neighborhood or our country or whatever, using these older people as informants. Well, that capability of the cell phone to do video recording is here a very valuable educational resource. But it's that same capability that produced the problem in the situation that you just described with the teacher and the hair on fire. The recording of the teacher with the hair on fire. And we can't say, well, here's this resource, but you can only use it for these purposes and you can't use it for the others. Once it's there, it's going to be used for a lot of different purposes. I often use the example of the automobile, that roughly 100 years ago, if you had said to people, hey, there's this great new invention, you can use it to get around the town, to travel across the country, it will create new jobs in new cities, it will create much more mobility, families will be able to see each other, but you have to build highways, which will cover the ground in concrete. You have to build parking lots. The automobiles create pollution. You need to buy gasoline, which means you need to buy oil, which means you're dependent on Middle Eastern economies, and maybe that promotes terrorism. So suddenly now there's all these bad things that we realize that automobiles also bring with them, both directly and indirectly. And if you had said to people 100 years ago, you have the choice. Do you want it or not? We don't realize how dependent we become on technologies until they've already become so much part of our lives that it becomes almost impossible to imagine going backward between the things that we want that are educationally valuable in these technologies and the things that we don't want that are, as I said before, even anti-educational, or they interfere with education. And that dilemma is where we're living as educators today. And as I said, I think we'll still be living with it in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years. The technologies will change, but the dilemma, I think, is an existential dilemma.